Hi, welcome everyone to my presentation on Android APIs in general, and specifically those involved in setting up voice recognition and text-to-speech functionality. First, let's do a quick review of what exactly an API is. To put it simply, as the name application programming interface suggests, it is essentially a mechanism that enables two software components to communicate with each other. This is done using a set of definitions and protocols. In the context of Android APIs, they are generally classes or libraries that provide built-in functionality to your app that might otherwise be next to impossible to implement. In my case, it is the functionality of recognizing spoken commands and converting written text into spoken statements. If I were to try to write the code necessary to perform these actions on my own, it would be prohibitively difficult. However, Google provides two accessible classes that implement this functionality for me. All I need to do is import each class into my project and then follow the guidelines provided in the API documentation. The API documentation provides information on where and how the specific API can be instantiated, all the provided attributes, and most importantly, all the public methods that are available, as well as the required inputs to use those methods and the return type. Now, let's dive into what it takes to implement one of these APIs. Out of the two, the speech recognizer was the more restrictive for me to set up. The first requirement that is placed on using the class is that you can only invoke any of its methods from the main application thread. This ended up making my main activity much more bloated than it would otherwise have been, and it made it more difficult to apply a design pattern like Model View Presenter as I was attempting to do in my project. This is because it limits the ability to adhere to the principle of decoupling when you are limited to where you can place certain methods. A second limitation that results in even more functionality problems is that the class is not designed for continuous recognition. This is because the main functionality of the service is to act as an interface between your app and the remote servers that perform the voice recognition. Using continuous recognition would result in using a significant amount of battery and bandwidth. The bottom line here is that you can't easily make your app function like a voice assistant where you can just start speaking and it picks it up. Instead, you need to provide a mechanism like a button in the user interface that starts the voice recognition. Ultimately, that makes the app just a bit more clunky to use. Another requirement to use the class is that you must set up your app to provide a request for permission to use the service since it is recording the user's voice. Given the restrictions, implementing the API was actually fairly simple, and I had fewer issues with it than most of my other theoretically simpler classes. After instantiating a speech recognizer object and setting a listener on it, you simply need to provide code to the resulting overridden methods. In my case, most of these methods needed no additional code, and the only one that required much work was providing the instructions on what to do with the results once they are returned to the app. The accuracy of the speech recognition is surprisingly impressive too. In all my testing, I only had a handful of times it provided an incorrect interpretation of what was said. The text-to-speech was even easier to implement, as it really only requires you to set a listener to notify your app once the text-to-speech object is initialized. Then it is only a matter of providing a string of text and calling the speak method. You can even play with aspects like pitch, rate of speech, and voice quality to get the sound of the voice to be what you want it to be. While initially a little daunting, once I understood how to use the provided documentation, using the provided APIs for Android apps proved very straightforward and worthwhile in constructing my app. Ultimately, the use of these APIs allowed me to create a much more interactive and user-friendly application that would not have been otherwise possible. Thanks everyone for listening.